Everyone saw the warm smile of America's favorite aunt. Frances Bavier, as Aunt B, was the moral compass of Mayberry, a symbol of kindness, comfort, and unconditional love. But the moment the cameras stopped rolling, that gentle smile vanished, replaced by a cold silence that terrified the cast. The woman the world adored was, behind the scenes, known as the most difficult person on set, and the one person she clashed with the most was the star himself, Andy Griffith. This wasn't a simple disagreement. It was a bitter, decade-long feud rooted in professional pride, secret grudges, and a deep-seated resentment that would poison the set for years. The wholesome family everyone loved was a lie, and it all started because Frances Bavier had a secret. She hated being Aunt B. She wasn't just some actress who got lucky with a TV role. Frances was a product of the New York stage, a classically trained performer who had studied at the American Academy of Dramatic Arts. She lived for the complex language of theater, the challenge of a dramatic role, the hush of a captivated Broadway audience. She saw herself as a serious artist, a contemporary of the greats. Then, Hollywood called with a role that would define her life and destroy her spirit. The role was Aunt B, a simple, small-town cook whose biggest dramatic moments involved judging a pickle contest or worrying about Opie. To Frances, this wasn't acting, it was a caricature. It was, in her eyes, a professional insult delivered daily. She arrived on set not with gratitude, but with a simmering frustration. She saw the simple, folksy dialogue as beneath her. She found the fast-paced, technically driven world of television production to be crude compared to the deliberate artistry of the stage. The crew, used to the easygoing, laughter-filled atmosphere encouraged by Andy Griffith, didn't know what to make of her. She was professional, yes, always knew her lines, always hit her marks, but she was cold, distant, easily offended. The slightest change in the script, the smallest direction from a producer, would be met with a sigh or a sharp, critical question. The production team quickly learned to walk on eggshells around her, handling her with extreme caution. They just wanted to get through the scene without an incident. But this quiet tension was building, and Frances was on a direct collision course with the one man who had absolute control over the Mayberry universe. The man who wasn't just her co-star, but also her boss, Andy Griffith. He saw her behavior not just as difficult, but as a direct threat to the gentle, harmonious world he was trying to build, both on and off the camera. He started to watch her closely, his patience wearing thin. The idyllic peace of Mayberry was about to be shattered by a war fought entirely in whispers and resentful glances. If you'd like to support the research we do to uncover deep stories like this one, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel. Your support means we can continue to bring these untold truths to light. To understand why Frances Babier's behavior was so toxic to the set, you have to understand the man Andy Griffith was. He wasn't just the star. As a 50% owner of the show, he was the king. He had established a strict, almost sacred rule for his set, a no swearing, no yelling policy. He wanted a calm, professional, family atmosphere where creativity could flourish. He saw the show as a gentle escape from the world's chaos, and he demanded that his set reflect that same gentleness. He was a generous performer, meticulously setting up the jokes so that his co-stars, especially Don Knotts, could hit the punchline and get the big laugh. He was the anchor, the calm center. And into this peaceful kingdom came Frances Bavier, a storm cloud of theatrical tension and quiet disdain. Andy Griffith didn't just dislike her attitude, he saw it as a personal betrayal of the show's entire philosophy. It was a daily battle. Sources from the set described how Frances would question the writers, nitpick her dialogue, and treat the crew with a cold formality that bordered on contempt. This created a paralyzing tension. Writers reportedly became afraid to pitch jokes for Aunt B, fearing her critical rejection. The crew would finish her scenes as fast as possible just to get away from her energy. This deep chill isolated Frances. making her feel even more like an outsider, which, in turn, only seemed to sour her demeanor further. It was a vicious, silent cycle. But here's where the story takes a shocking turn, revealing just how bad the tension had become. The one person on set who seemed completely immune to her difficult nature was, surprisingly, Jim Nabors, who played the lovable Gomer Pyle. Nabors had a sunny, unfailingly polite disposition, and for some reason, he and Frances got along beautifully. He was perhaps the only person who saw the lonely, frustrated artist underneath the prickly exterior, and he was the only one brave enough to confront Andy Griffith about it. According to production staff, Nabors, who was still just a supporting character at the time, approached Andy Griffith directly, the star and 50% owner of the show. The crew held their breath. Nabors allegedly looked his boss in the eye and said, "Andy, she's a good actress. You be nice to her." The audacity of that moment cannot be overstated. A relatively new actor was telling the king of the castle to check his own behavior. Griffith, who was known for his absolute control, was reportedly stunned into silence. He was being called out for his own grudge, his own lack of patience. The feud was no longer a secret. It was now an open conflict that the entire cast was being forced to navigate. Andy was furious that his authority was challenged, but he was also forced to confront a hard truth. His open disdain for Frances was now just as much a part of the problem as her own behavior. This confrontation didn't fix things. It solidified the battle lines. From that day forward, Andy Griffith and Frances Bavier were locked in a professional Cold War. They would perform their loving, heartwarming scenes as mother and son. The camera would cut, and they would immediately retreat to opposite corners, not speaking again until the next take. This wasn't just a clash of personalities anymore. It was a deep personal wound. And that wound was about to get infected by another, far more public scandal.
The set of the Andy Griffith Show was now a battlefield of fractured alliances. The Cold War between Andy and Frances had become the new toxic normal. The cast and crew were forced to pick sides, either consciously or unconsciously. You were either Team Andy, easygoing, professional, part of the family, or you were an outsider, navigating the icy silence that surrounded Frances Bavier. It was a miserable way to work. Frances, feeling increasingly isolated, retreated further into herself, her acting becoming stiffer, her demeanor more brittle. Andy, feeling his authority and the show's entire family ethos had been disrespected by her attitude, became even more rigorously controlling of the set's atmosphere. They were two magnets repelling each other, and the energy was palpable. Everyone could feel it. But this quiet, simmering tension was nothing compared to the explosion that was coming, and it would be triggered by one of the most powerful men in Hollywood. Danny Thomas wasn't just some guest star. He was the executive producer of the show. It was his backdoor pilot episode on his hit series, The Danny Thomas Show, that had launched Mayberry in the first place. In many ways, he was the big boss, the man who signed the checks, the mogul whose name was on the studio. And Danny Thomas came from the old school of Hollywood, loud, abrasive, and relentlessly demanding. He was the human bulldozer, the polar opposite of Andy's sacred no-yelling rule. When Danny Thomas came to visit the set, the crew didn't relax. They braced for impact. He was a force of nature, and on one fateful day, that force of nature collided directly with Mayberry's most volatile element, Frances Bavier.
They were in the middle of blocking a scene. Andy, Frances, and Danny Thomas, who was overseeing the production. Frances, in her usual meticulous way, was likely questioning a line, or her motivation, or the placement of a prop. She was being difficult. Danny Thomas, who had zero patience for what he saw as an ungrateful TV actress's artistic attitude, lost it. He didn't care about Andy's gentle set. This was his show, and he was losing time. In front of the entire cast and crew, he began to yell. He raised his voice and tore into Frances Bavier, berating her for holding up production. The set went dead silent. You could hear a pin drop. Everyone froze, their eyes darting to Andy Griffith. This was his set, his kingdom, and the ultimate boss had just broken his single most important rule by attacking the one person Andy himself couldn't stand. But what happened next shocked everyone and proved who truly held the power in Mayberry. Andy Griffith had a choice. He could stay silent, he could let his own enemy, Francis, take the heat from the big boss. It would have been easy. It might have even felt satisfying. But Andy Griffith was not just a star. He was a fierce protector of his set. He didn't care if he liked Francis or not. She was one of his actors, and Danny Thomas had crossed the line. Andy stopped the rehearsal. He didn't yell. He didn't make a scene. He just turned, walked off the set, and went straight to the production office. He found Sheldon Leonard, the other producer. His voice, when he spoke, was cold, quiet, and absolutely lethal. According to set legend, Andy Griffith looked at Sheldon Leonard and delivered an ultimatum that would echo through Hollywood. He said, "Sheldon, I don't care who he is. You get that man off my set. He is never to come back here again." Andy Griffith had just declared war on his own executive producer. He had just demanded that the man who helped create the show be banned from its set, all to protect the one actress he personally despised. The entire show, the careers of everyone involved, hung in the balance of this power play. Sheldon Leonard now had an impossible choice: appease his A-list star or back his powerful business partner. The fate of Mayberry rested on that one decision. The silence in Sheldon Leonard's office was deafening. Andy Griffith had thrown down the gauntlet, creating a showdown between the show's 50% owner and star and its powerful executive producer, Danny Thomas. Leonard, a pragmatic and brilliant businessman, had to make a choice. On one hand, Danny Thomas was his longtime partner, a Hollywood titan. On the other hand, Andy Griffith was the Andy Griffith Show. He wasn't just the lead actor, he was the entire brand, the heart and the soul of a multi-million-dollar empire. In a cold, hard financial calculation, the choice was brutal but simple. You can't have the Andy Griffith Show without Andy Griffith. The king had made his move, and the producers had to fold. Sheldon Leonard agreed to Andy's terms. Word came down the pipeline. Danny Thomas was, from that moment on, banned from the set of the Andy Griffith Show. It was a stunning display of raw power. Andy Griffith had not only defended an actress he personally disliked, but he had also exiled a Hollywood mogul from his own show to do it. The crew was in awe. Andy's authority was now absolute, his kingdom secure. But this victory didn't bring peace. It brought something far more complex: a cold, awkward, and permanent chill. Frances Bavier, the classically trained actress, was now in the humiliating position of being publicly saved by a man she knew couldn't stand her. She wasn't an equal. She was a difficult asset that the boss had decided to protect for the good of the company. This didn't heal the wound, it just sealed it over with ice. But if you think this grand gesture of protection led to a tearful reconciliation or even a polite thank you, you fundamentally misunderstand the depth of the resentment. The feud didn't end. It simply entered its final, tragic phase. Frances and Andy settled into a cold peace. They were consummate professionals. They showed up, they said their lines, they created the warm, loving chemistry of Andy and Aunt Bee that the camera demanded. They were brilliant actors, but the moment the director yelled "cut," the silence was immediate. They would retreat to their separate corners, Andy to joke with the crew or play the guitar, Frances to her dressing room, alone. For the next several years, this became the unspoken reality of the show. The loving family everyone tuned in to watch was a magnificent illusion, performed by two people who, for all intents and purposes, had stopped speaking to each other outside of the script. The real tragedy for Frances was that she was trapped. The show was a colossal hit, and Aunt Bee was one of the most beloved characters in television history. The public adored her. They sent her fan mail, recipes, and gifts. But every fan letter felt like another bar on her cage. She felt she was a serious dramatic artist who was being celebrated for, in her mind, playing a folksy, simple-minded caricature. This internal conflict, the chasm between her artistic ambition and her public persona, only deepened her isolation. She was lonely, surrounded by people, and famous for a role she had come to despise. And as the show neared the end of its legendary run, she would have to make a choice that would seal her fate, a choice that no one saw coming. When Andy Griffith finally decided to leave the show in 1968, the producers had an idea. The show would be retooled. It would be called Mayberry RFD, and they wanted Frances Bavier to stay. The one person who hated being Aunt Bee was now being asked to be Aunt Bee forever, and she was the only one who didn't have an escape plan. Frances Bavier was faced with an impossible choice. Andy Griffith, her antagonist but also her greatest professional partner, was leaving. The show that had made her a star and a prisoner was ending. But the machine wasn't stopping. The producers offered her a lifeline that was also an anchor. Continue playing Aunt Bee in the new series Mayberry RFD. For a moment, she had a chance to escape, to return to the theater, to reclaim the artistic identity she felt she had sacrificed. But where would she go? She was in her late 60s. To the world, she wasn't Frances Bavier, dramatic actress. She was Aunt Bee. The role she hated was the only one Hollywood was offering. And so, with a sense of grim resignation, she said yes. She stayed in Mayberry for 2 more years, a ghost haunting her own past. The show was still popular, but the magic was gone. Andy was gone, Opie was gone, the set was different, but Frances was still there, trapped in the same kitchen, wearing the same apron, delivering the same simple, comforting lines. It was a professional purgatory. Then, in 1971, the axe fell. CBS, in a shocking and cold-blooded business move known as the Rural Purge, canceled all of its country-themed shows overnight. Mayberry RFD, Hee Haw, Green Acres, all gone, despite high ratings. The network wanted a younger, more sophisticated urban audience. Frances Bavier didn't get a farewell episode. She didn't get a graceful exit. After more than a decade of playing America's aunt, she was simply fired. The role she had given her life to and resented for just as long was gone, not with a bang, but with a sterile corporate memo. But the true tragedy wasn't that her career was over. It's what she did next. This was her moment. The prison doors were finally, brutally thrown open. She was free. She made one last, brief appearance in the 1974 film Benji, and then she vanished. Frances Bavier, the New York stage actress, did something no one could have predicted. She didn't move back to New York to be near Broadway. She didn't stay in Hollywood. She packed her bags, left the industry forever, and moved to a small, quiet town in North Carolina. The town she chose was Siler City, ironically, a sleepy rural community just a short drive from Andy Griffith's own hometown. She had, in essence, moved into Mayberry. She bought a large 2-story house, filled it with her beloved cats, and shut the door on the world. For the next 2 decades, Frances Bavier lived as a recluse. The woman who had played the warmest, most welcoming figure on television became a notorious hermit. The people of Siler City were excited at first, hoping to catch a glimpse of Aunt Bee. But they didn't find Aunt Bee. They found Frances Bavier, a private, guarded, and often irritable woman who just wanted to be left alone. She rarely left her home. Her house began to fall into disrepair, the paint peeling, the yard overgrown. Rumors swirled around town about the strange, lonely woman in the big house. She was living the ultimate tragic irony. She had finally escaped the role of the small-town matriarch, only to become the cliché of the small-town recluse. She had escaped the spotlight, but found only isolation. She was living, and would ultimately die, profoundly alone. This was the crushing price of her feud, her pride, and her fame. But as the years turned into decades, and her health began to fail, she realized there was one piece of unfinished business, one relationship that was still unresolved, one final call she had to make. It was 1989. Frances Bavier had been living in isolation for nearly 20 years. Her health was failing, she was battling heart disease and cancer, and her large, dark house had become her world, her fortress, and her prison. The floors were cluttered, the rooms filled with the 24 cats she cared for, her only steady companions. The vibrant New York actress was gone. The beloved TV aunt was a fading memory. All that was left was a proud, sick, and profoundly lonely old woman facing her own mortality. In those long, quiet, pain-filled days, the past has a way of becoming incredibly clear. The grudges, the anger, the professional pride that had cost her so much, it all seemed to fade, replaced by a single, gnawing weight: regret. There was one person who represented this entire unresolved chapter of her life. The man she had resented as a symbol of the simple world she despised, but also the man who had, in his own way, protected her. The man who had been her screen partner for 8 years, yet a stranger for 20. She knew she was running out of time, that no yelling rule, that fight with Danny Thomas, the cold silences on set, the final, humiliating apology, it all swirled together. She had to make it right. With what little strength she had, she found a phone number and dialed. Miles away, in his own life, a telephone rang. Andy Griffith picked up. He heard a voice he hadn't heard in years, faint, brittle, but unmistakable. It was Francis. The man who had once banned a mogul for her was now listening to the voice of a dying woman. We will never know the exact words of that entire conversation. It was a private moment between two people who had shared a global spotlight and a secret war. But Andy Griffith, moved by the call, later shared its powerful conclusion. After the small talk faded, Frances Bavier, the woman who had built a fortress of pride around herself, finally let the walls crumble. She told him she was sick. She told him she was sorry. She admitted that all those years ago on set, she had been difficult. It was the confession he had probably waited 20 years to hear. But it wasn't a victory. It was a tragedy. It was the sound of a brilliant, stubborn artist finally making peace, not just with him, but with herself, at the very end of her life. But the story doesn't end with her apology. It ends with Andy's response, which reveals the true, heartbreaking complexity of it all. Andy didn't just accept her apology. He understood. He later told friends and interviewers about the call, and he wasn't triumphant. He was deeply saddened. He spoke of Frances Bavier not as a monster, but as a victim of her own temperament and training. He acknowledged her immense talent as a stage actress and understood, perhaps too late, that she felt the role of Aunt B was beneath her. He recognized her difficult nature was the defense mechanism of a frustrated artist trapped in a golden cage. He, too, expressed his own regret that they could never find common ground. 4 months after that phone call, in December 1989, Frances Bavier died alone in her Siler City home. Her death certificate listed the immediate cause as a heart attack, but the underlying causes were a life of illness and isolation. She had achieved peace, but she didn't live to enjoy it. The feud was over. What remains is the complicated truth. Frances Bavier was not the Angel of Mayberry. She was a complex, proud, and often unhappy woman, but her story isn't one of a villain. It's a timeless Hollywood tragedy about the devastating cost of pride, the corrosive nature of resentment, and the profound human gap between the characters we love on screen and the fragile people who play them.
Mayberry was full of secrets, but it wasn't the only town in television hiding a dark history. If you were shocked by the truth behind Andy and Aunt B, you won't believe the stories we're uncovering next. Don't miss a single hidden story. Hit that like button if you appreciated this look behind the curtain, and subscribe to our channel right now so you're the first to know when the next secret is revealed.